She walked into the wrong terminal at Crestline Regional Airport. On the morning, she had 12 minutes to make her connection, and the man in the corner of the restricted overflow room said a word she hadn't heard in 4 years. Not her name, her call sign. She stopped. Around her, 6 airport police officers were doing the specific thing that trained personnel did when they had run out of trained responses. They were talking louder and standing closer, and none of it was working. The man in the corner, who the incident report would later describe as a non-compliant individual exhibiting signs of acute psychological distress, had not moved in 40 minutes. He was sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up and his hands pressed flat against his thighs and his eyes fixed on a point approximately 3 feet above and to the left of anyone attempting to make contact with him. He was 28 years old, she would learn later, though he looked older in the way that some people looked older, not from age, but from the specific compression of having carried too much in too short a time. The word he said wasn't loud. It was barely audible over the noise bleeding in from the main terminal, but she heard it. Her body stopped before her brain fully processed why. The nearest officer turned to her. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with the posture of someone who had been in charge of rooms for so long that he'd stopped noticing when he wasn't. His badge read SGT, D. Priest. Ma'am, flat, dismissive before she'd even opened her mouth. This is a restricted area. You need to return to the main terminal immediately. Vera Quinlan looked at him and then looked past him at the man in the corner, and then she said, "He's not a threat." Priest blinked. It wasn't the response he'd been expecting. People said sorry, or of course, or I was just looking for the bathroom. They didn't make calm declarative statements about the situation he was actively managing. Ma'am. He's in a dissociative state. She kept her voice level. Not psychotic, not violent, dissociative. What you're doing right now, moving closer, raising your voice, it's making it worse. It will keep making it worse. Priest stared at her. He looked at her carry-on bag. He looked at her hospital ID, clipped to her lanyard. Crestline Valley Medical Center, Vera Quinlan, RN, and the particular expression that crossed his face was one she had seen before, on the faces of people who had decided in the first 3 seconds what category of person they were dealing with and found it inconvenient when new information failed to support that decision. "I appreciate your concern," he said, in the tone people used when they did not appreciate anything at all. "But this situation is being handled by trained personnel. You need to leave this area right now, or I'll have you removed." She should have left. She was 12 minutes from missing her connection. She had been awake for 19 hours, covering a double shift at Crestline Valley before catching the first flight out, and the coffee she'd grabbed from the kiosk near security was already cold. She looked at the man in the corner again. His hands were doing it, the specific self-stimming pattern, pressing flat and releasing in a rhythm that was slightly too fast to be conscious. 4 beats. Pause. 4 beats. She had seen that exact pattern once before, in a different country, in a different context, in circumstances she was legally prohibited from describing in detail. She had not been a travel nurse then. She had been someone else entirely. She set her carry-on bag down. She did not leave. The morning had started the way most of Vera Quinlan's mornings started, running on less sleep than was medically advisable, fueled by the particular hollow competence that ear nurses developed after years of being functional when the rest of the world wasn't. She was 30 years old. She'd been a travel nurse for 6 years, cycling through contracts at hospitals in 4 different states, which meant she was perpetually between places, between assignments, between furnished apartments that smelled like other people's decisions, between the version of herself she used at work and whatever came out in the quiet hours she spent alone. Her current posting was Crestline Valley Medical Center, 6 weeks into a 13-week ER contract, and she was going home to Denver to see her younger sister for the first time since November. She'd packed wrong, which was nothing new. Left her good headphones on the bathroom counter, realized it in the rideshare, decided the headphones could wait because her sister couldn't. Security had been manageable. Gate 31, per the departures board, was a 20-minute walk from where the checkpoint deposited her. She'd taken the corridor that looked like it connected to the C concourse. The sign was there. She didn't see it. Her brain was running at cruising altitude, sleep deprivation and logistics, calculating whether she had time to eat before boarding, trying to remember her sister's new boyfriend's job. Something in finance or maybe consulting. She couldn't remember and had been meaning to ask for 3 weeks. She pushed through a door. The restricted overflow room was a holding area, large enough for 3 rows of blue airport seating, currently empty except for the cluster of officers and the man in the corner, and 2 paramedics standing near the door with a gurney they had clearly already decided not to push forward. She read the scene in about 4 seconds, the way she read trauma bays. And then the man in the corner said her call sign, quietly, without looking at her, and the bottom dropped out of her chest. Sergeant Priest came back to her a second time when she didn't leave. "Ma'am." His voice had dropped a register, the register that people in authority used when they were signaling the end of polite requests. "I won't ask again." "He said something when I walked in," Vera said. "A specific word. I need you to ask him when he last heard that word, because the answer is going to tell you something important about why he's here." Priest looked at her with an expression she could only describe as controlled contempt. "You're a nurse." "Yes." "From Crestline Valley Medical." "Yes." "You walked through the wrong door by mistake." He said it the way someone read back a statement they were planning to use against you. "And now you're telling me how to manage an active incident." "I'm telling you that what you're doing isn't working, and that I know what might." A sound from somewhere in the middle of the room. Not from the man in the corner. From a woman who had been standing slightly apart from the cluster of officers, with the particular stillness of someone who listened more than they spoke. She was compact, late 30s, with quiet that came from years of knowing that information lived in the gap between what people said and what they did. Her badge read SGT I Bowen. She had been watching Vera since the moment Vera walked in. More specifically, she had been watching the man in the corner watch Vera. "Hold on," Bowen said. Priest turned. "Bowen." "1 second." She crossed the room toward Vera and stopped 6 feet away. Her eyes moved from Vera's hands to her posture to the carry-on to the hospital ID and back up. The assessment was efficient and made no pretense of being anything else. "You heard what he said when you came in." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Vera said. "What did he say?" Vera looked at her carefully. She made the kind of calculation that she had learned to make quickly about people, the kind that determined how much truth the moment required and how much the person in front of her could actually receive. Bowen's eyes were steady, patient, the look of someone who already suspected something and was waiting to see if the data would confirm it. "He used a word that isn't in any standard crisis protocol," Vera said. "It's a designator. From a specific program. He shouldn't know it unless he encountered that program during active service." Bowen was quiet for a moment. "How do you know it?" Vera didn't answer that. Behind Bowen's shoulder, Priest made a sound that was not quite a scoff, but was moving in that direction. "She's a civilian who walked through the wrong door. She doesn't have any basis to." "Donnie." Bowen said his name flat and quiet, the way you said a word to stop a sentence before it could finish. She kept her eyes on Vera. "What's your background? Before the hospital?" Vera adjusted the strap of her carry-on. The man in the corner, she still didn't know his name, made a sound, low and involuntary, as if registering her small movement. Not aggression. Something else. She could feel it the way you felt a frequency more than heard it. "I'm an ER nurse," Vera said. "Trauma and critical care. I've been at Crestline Valley for 6 weeks, and before that I was at facilities in Arizona, Tennessee, and Oregon." She paused and met Bowen's eyes. "Before that is before that." Bowen repeated the phrase softly, like she was checking a translation. "Before that." The paramedic near the gurney exhaled. He was young, early 20s, with the look of someone who had been holding his breath for the better part of an hour. He glanced at Bowen. "He hasn't responded to anything we've tried in 40 minutes. We've done verbal, we've done proximity approach. The department crisis counselor said she'd never seen anyone hold a dissociative state this long without physical intervention." Priest turned to him. "Nobody asked you, Patel." Patel didn't look away from Bowen. Vera watched the man in the corner. His name was Corporal Dean Albright. She would learn later, 28 years old. Separated from service 14 months ago, honorably, after 2 deployments. His flight to Seattle had been at 6:15 that morning. Someone at the gate flagged him when he stopped responding to boarding calls. When officers approached, he hadn't resisted. He had simply stopped participating in reality, checked out so completely that the world had become something he was no longer inside of. That was what a dissociative episode looked like from the outside, like absence. Like a door closing from the inside with no handle on the other side. Vera knew what it looked like from the inside as well, not from personal experience, from 4 years inside a program that had trained her specifically to reach people behind that door. The program had been called Anchor. It no longer officially existed. "He's going to escalate," she said. Not aggressive. Just a read delivered clean, the way she gave reads in trauma bays when there were too many voices and someone needed the room to listen. Not because he wants to, because the stimulus load has hit a threshold his nervous system cannot hold. He's been maintaining the dissociative state because it's the only way he knows to keep himself from what's underneath it. She looked at Priest directly. When the hold breaks, and it will, he'll come back into his body fast and disoriented, in a room full of people he doesn't recognize. That is when this becomes dangerous, not before. Silence. Priest's jaw was doing something complicated. He had the look of a man who understood authority primarily as something rooms gave him, and who was recalibrating in real time what it meant when someone simply declined to be managed by it. "You don't have standing to." "I know what the word means that he said to me," Vera said, "and I know why he said it when I walked through that door. That means I have information you don't have, and right now that information is relevant." She held his gaze. "That is my standing." Bowen made the call, not with a speech, simply by positioning herself between Vera and Priest and saying, in a voice that was not loud but was definitively final, "Let her try." Priest looked at her. The expression on his face moved through several stages. Authority, irritation, and then the complicated flicker of a man who had been in enough situations to recognize when someone pushing back was doing it from certainty rather than ego. He didn't give permission. He stepped aside. Which was the same thing. Vera set her carry-on against the wall. She looked at Dean Albright for a long moment. The 4-beat pattern in his hands had shifted. 3 beats now, slightly faster, which meant the baseline underneath the stillness was rising. Without intervention, the stillness would break. When it broke, it would not break quietly. She walked to the center of the room. Not toward him, not circling him, just to the center, where he could see her without having to track movement, where she was directly in his sightline if his eyes moved at all. She stood there with her hands loose at her sides. She breathed. And then, in a voice pitched low and absolutely certain, she said a single word. It was not in any crisis response manual, not a de-escalation technique, not a negotiation phrase, not anything retrievable from any training document currently in existence. It was one word from a protocol so classified that its terminology had been formally retired from all active documentation and existed now only in the muscle memory of people who had been inside it. Dean Albright's hand stopped. Not slowed, stopped. His eyes moved, the first time in 40 minutes, and they found Vera's face. The quality of focus in them was entirely different from the blankness before. Not recovered, not fully present, but reaching. The look of someone who had heard something their nervous system recognized as a signal from a map they thought they had lost entirely. Behind Vera, someone said very quietly, "What?" Priest said nothing. His silence had changed quality. Vera took one step closer, just one. She kept her voice at the same register, low, unhurried, certain. She said the second phrase in the sequence, paused and waited. Albright's breathing changed, a single longer exhale, then another. Physiologically small, but it was the equivalent of a door moving by an inch, the first voluntary regulation his body had done in over an hour. His hands, still flat on his thighs, turned slightly, not aggressive, not surrender. The gesture of someone confirming their body was still there. "He's coming back," Patel said from the doorway, and there was something in his voice that was the precise opposite of clinical. Bowen had moved to stand behind Vera's left shoulder without being told. Not close, she understood proximity management, but present. Vera crouched down, eye level, the way you move towards someone who had been somewhere far away and needed to find the return route without being rushed. "You're at Crestline Regional," she said quietly. "Not the call sign, just information. Anchoring airport, civilian, you're safe here." A pause. "Take your time." Albright looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not the flat absence from before, but the complicated compression of someone accounting for a distance they had traveled without meaning to. "They said the program was gone," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "They said everyone was reassigned." "Most of us were," Vera said. "Are you?" He stopped, started again. "Are you real?" "Yes," she said, "and so are you. You're here." What happened in his face then was not something she had a clean category for. Not relief. Relief was too light a word for what moved through him. It was the particular release of a thing long held, the moment when a person who has been gripping something for so long allows their hand to open and discovers their fingers still work. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "I thought I was losing it," he said. "You weren't losing it," Vera said. "You were protecting yourself. Those are different things." Behind her, the room was completely still. The formal questions came after. Once Patel and the second paramedic had gotten Albright water and a blanket and moved him to a chair that wasn't against a wall. He was coherent now, not fully recovered. That would take time and proper support, but present, answering in full sentences, apologizing to the officers with a steadiness that made Priest's jaw do something complicated and private. Bowen pulled Vera aside. "That word you used," she said, "the protocol." Vera looked at her. "Where does that come from?" It was the same question, the same careful framing that Vera had expected since the moment Albright's hands went still and the room ran out of trained responses. "A program," Vera said. "It doesn't exist anymore." "What kind of program trains ZR nurses to reach veterans in dissociative episodes using classified call signs?" "The kind that understood that the gap between medical support and psychological support in combat environments was a liability," Vera said, "and that the people who most needed help after deployment were often the least likely to seek it through standard channels." Bowen was quiet for a moment. "You were embedded with them, in the field." Vera didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it either. Bowen's expression had shifted. The look of someone who has been presented with a door they didn't know existed and is deciding whether they want to know what's behind it. "That call sign he used. That's been retired from all documentation. Which means he encountered the program during active service. Which means," she stopped, "his service record is going to show things I don't currently have clearance for." "Probably," Vera said. "And yours." The door at the far end of the corridor opened. Not the door Vera had come through, the interior access door that connected to the deeper sections of the transit staging area. A man came through it with the movement of someone who had been walking fast for some time and was not planning to slow down. He was in uniform, older than anyone else in the room, with the kind of rank on his collar that made Bowen straighten automatically and Priest go very still. Commander Neil Sharp. She would learn his name in the next 45 seconds. He scanned the room. His eyes found Vera in approximately 3 seconds and did not move. "Bowen," he said without looking away. "Situation report." "Sir, incident resolved. Subject is stable and coherent. Medically cleared. Currently in debrief." Bowen paused one beat. An unauthorized civilian was instrumental in the resolution. "Outlied civilian." Sharp said it the way you tested words for accuracy. He walked toward Vera, unhurried, the stride of someone who treated urgency as a resource rather than a default state. He stopped 8 feet away and looked at her with the methodical attention of a man who had spent decades reading people in rooms where the stakes did not forgive imprecision. "Name: Vera Quinlan. Crestline Valley Medical." "Yes." "You're an ER nurse." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression of a man who has been given a category that does not account for what he is currently looking at. "And Sergeant Priest flagged your arrival as an unauthorized incursion. And then instead of leaving, you intervened in an active incident using a verbal protocol that no one in this room has clearance to know about. A pause. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. How did you learn the protocol? Vera was quiet. I'm going to ask you one direct question, Sharp said. You can tell me it's above my clearance level, and I will accept that answer, but I'd prefer you didn't. He held her gaze steadily. Were you, at any point, affiliated with a crisis intervention program operating under a designation I probably should not say out loud in this room? The stillness that followed was the loudest thing in the space. Albright, from across the room, had gone quiet in a different way, the attentive quiet of someone who understands the shape of a conversation without hearing all of it. Vera looked at Sharp. She made a decision about what kind of person was in front of her. If you can access records for a program-designated Anchor, dissolved approximately 4 years ago on administrative grounds, the operational parameters are documented there. She paused. The contact name on the dissolution records would be Dr. Asha Mehta, formerly of the DoD Behavioral Research Division. Sharp went completely still. Bowen's breath caught, quiet but audible. Priest said nothing. His face had moved past the performance of authority into something that looked, on close inspection, like a man whose understanding of the ground beneath him had just shifted by several degrees. Vera picked up her carry-on. I'd appreciate it if someone makes sure Corporal Albright receives an actual psychological support referral before he's cleared to travel. Not a pamphlet, a real referral, to a provider with experience in combat-related dissociative presentations. She looked at Bowen. And someone should look into whether this is the first time he's presented like this or whether there's a pattern the VA has been missing. She walked toward the exit. She was 4 steps from the door when Bowen said, "Quinlan, wait." Not an order, something else in it. Vera turned. Bowen was holding her phone with the expression of someone who has just received information that has rearranged the afternoon she thought she was having. Commander Sharp's office ran a records query 2 minutes ago. She looked up. Standard queries take 6 to 8 hours. What they received instead was a directive from a division I don't have the clearance to name, requesting that the commander render full professional courtesy to a Vera Quinlan, RN, and keep the interaction discreet. She paused. The directive came in before the query was submitted. The room was very still. Sharp looked at Vera with the expression of a man who has realized the situation he was managing is significantly larger than the room it currently occupies. Someone was already watching, Bowen said. Not an accusation, just an observation from someone whose job was to notice the things that didn't fit. Priest found her when the formal questions were mostly finished, when Sharp had stepped out to make calls, and Bowen was on the phone with the VA liaison coordinating Albright's referral. He came across the room without the performance his presence had carried 3 hours ago. What was underneath it was more uncertain than she'd expected, and younger looking for it. Miss Quinlan. She looked at him. He held it, which she gave him credit for. Some people, when they discovered they'd been wrong, couldn't look directly at the person they'd been wrong toward. They got defensive, or they overcorrected into a performance of remorse, or they changed the subject entirely. Priest just stood there uncomfortable, which was at least honest. The things I said when you first came in. He stopped, looked at the floor, looked back up, the way I spoke to you when I thought you were just. He didn't finish the sentence. I don't have an excuse for it, not the tone and not the assumption. Vera looked at him steadily. You were doing your job, she said, and you were wrong about what your job required in that specific moment. A pause. Those two things can coexist. Something in his face shifted. Not absolution. She wasn't offering that, and he would have known it if she tried. Just an accurate accounting of what had happened, which was sometimes harder to receive than a merciful version. If I'd pushed the forced evacuation, he said quietly, the way I was about to, he would have come back into his body while people were moving fast in an unfamiliar direction, Vera said. His nervous system would have read that as threat. It would have been a very different outcome. Priest looked at the floor and nodded once. It was not an easy nod, but it was a real one. The call came when she was back in the main terminal, 11 minutes before her rescheduled departure. Not from an unknown number. From a contact listed in her phone simply as AM, which stood for Asha Mehta and which she had not received a call from in 4 years. Vera stepped to the side of the walkway and answered, "I heard you had an interesting morning." Dr. Mehta's voice was exactly what she remembered, measured with warmth that sat just underneath the precision. "You could say that. Sharp's office contacted mine about an hour ago. I was already in the city." A pause. "Vera, are you all right?" "I'm fine." She meant it. "He's going to be okay, with the right support." "He was one of ours," Mehta said, "from the final anchor cohort, before the dissolution." A brief silence. His VA records show 3 prior presentations that were misclassified. 3 times he showed up, made himself visible, and was given something that didn't have the language for what he was carrying. Vera closed her eyes for 1 second. 3 times. "I want the referral to go somewhere specific," she said, "not general mental health services. Someone who knows the program's methodology. Someone who will recognize what he went through and what it left behind." "I know 2 people," Mehta said. "I'll make the calls." "In writing," Vera said. A pause that contained something that might have been a quiet laugh. "You've gotten harder to negotiate with." 4 years of hospital administration. Vera looked at the departures board. Gate B12. 9 minutes. "Is the referral why you're calling, Asha?" A longer pause. "No." Mehta's voice shifted into the register she used when she was being entirely honest. "There are others like Dean Albright. Veterans who came through Anchor's cohorts, who were reached and then left without adequate transition when the program dissolved. We've been tracking them, building a network of people who can provide the specific kind of support they need." She paused. "You reached him in under 3 minutes when trained professionals couldn't reach him in 4 hours. You know why you were able to do that." Vera stood in the middle of the terminal walkway, with people moving past her in both directions, the ordinary ambient hum of a place that had returned to its routine without knowing how close to something it had been. She thought about her sister's apartment in Denver, the futon or the couch, the boyfriend with the job she couldn't remember. She thought about Albright's hand stopping. "I'm not leaving Crestline Valley," she said, "and I'm not available on someone else's schedule. Each situation gets discussed first. I have conditions, and the conditions aren't negotiable." "I know you do," Mehta said. "That's why I'm agreeing before you've finished." Vera looked at the departures board. "The others," she said. "How many?" Mehta told her. Vera was quiet for a long moment. The number was not small. "I'll call you from Denver," she said. "We'll talk through what's actually possible." She put the phone in her pocket and walked toward B12 at the pace of someone who was behind but had decided not to run, because the rushing part of the morning was behind her, and some things had an internal logic that carried you forward without urgency. She boarded with 2 minutes to spare. The gate agent gave her the look reserved for people who had cut it close and knew it. And Vera accepted it without argument because it was entirely deserved, and because she had spent the full available supply of her conflict for one morning, and then some. Middle seat. Of course it was the middle seat. The man by the window was asleep before they'd finished boarding. The woman on the aisle had a toddler on her lap who was investigating Vera's bag strap with the total absorption of a person encountering a bag strap for the very first time. "Sorry," the woman said. "It's fine," Vera said. She let the toddler hold the strap. The plane pushed back. The terminal receded through the window past the sleeping man's shoulder, glass and steel and signage, ordinary looking from the outside. The way places always looked ordinary from the outside, regardless of what they had contained. Vera watched it go and thought about Dean Albright sitting in a chair with a blanket and water, and Bowen making notes for the referral with the careful handwriting of someone who understood that the notes mattered, and Priest standing against a wall doing the private and uncomfortable work of being accurate about himself. She thought about Anchor, the program that had trained her to reach people behind closed doors, dissolved by people in offices who understood budget lines better than they understood what the work had been. She had been angry about that for a long time. She was still something about it. Not angry exactly, but something with more patience in it, which was probably what 4 years of emergency medicine did to a person. She thought about the number Meta had given her. The ones who had been reached and then left. 3 prior presentations, misclassified. 3 times Albright had shown up in a system that didn't have the language for him and had been handed back something that almost fit. She thought about what she had said to Bowen without planning to say it. The gap between medical support and psychological support is a liability. She had said it like a fact she believed. She did believe it. She had believed it for 4 years while working in emergency rooms and occasionally recognizing something she could not do anything about because the context didn't allow for what she knew how to do. Maybe the context was about to change, on her terms, with conditions that were real and documented and non-negotiable. The toddler fell asleep against her arm somewhere above the cloud line, heavy and boneless, the way small children slept, entirely committed to the process. Vera didn't move her arm. She looked out the window at the white expanse below and thought about her sister, who sent voice memos instead of texts and had no idea what her older sister's mornings sometimes looked like, which was fine. Which was exactly as it should be. She would call from Denver. She would sit across from her sister and drink the kind of tea that only existed in her sister's apartment and be precisely that. Just herself, just family, just the version of her that had opinions about TV shows and forgot other people's boyfriends' jobs and ran late sometimes and left phone chargers on counters. That version was real. She intended to keep being her. She was also the person who had walked into the wrong room at the wrong moment and heard a word that stopped her before her brain caught up to her body. She was the person who had crouched in front of a man behind a closed door for 4 hours and opened it in under 3 minutes, and who had felt in that moment something she recognized as entirely hers, not a relic of another life, but a proof of this one, extended. Those weren't 2 separate people wearing the same face. They were one person with a larger range than she sometimes allowed herself to use. The plane descended through the cloud cover. Denver appeared below, a grid of ordinary lights, her sister's neighborhood somewhere in all of it, the kettle probably already on. Vera looked at the city below and felt something settle in her chest that had been slightly loose since the moment she pushed through the wrong door at Crestline Regional Airport that morning. She had walked in by accident. She had walked out having changed one thing that needed changing, in a direction that mattered, by being exactly the person she already was. Nobody got to decide what that was worth except her. The wheels touched down, and she went to see her sister.